She held the reins of that horse like she was born to it. And now she was. The horse, the ranch, the dusty expanse stretching behind those sun-bleached buildings, everything Silas Garrett had poured his sweat and blood into for a decade. It was all hers. The woman staring down at him wore buckskin and beadwork, carrying it with an iron certainty that spoke of a life without refusal. Her people had materialized at his property line 3 days back, carrying papers that smelled of dust and history, documents older than any man breathing, proof that this land was never his to tame. And now Tala waited, poised for his reply to a demand that left no room for negotiation. C stood in the dirt-packed yard of what was, until 3 days ago, his ranch. The High Plains sun was already a brutal weight on his neck. Tala hadn't shifted on that horse for 5 solid minutes. She just watched him. Those dark eyes bored straight through the defenses he'd spent years building since burying his father. Tala. That's what her men called her when they rode in at sunup, not asking permission, just arriving like the land already knew their name. Which, it turned out, it did. A muscle in Silas's jaw jumped as he relived it. Judge Thorne, 3 days ago, staring at those brittle documents, then looking at Silas with an expression damn close to pity. The Apache claim was ironclad, legitimate, documented, older than the county lines themselves. His deed, the mortgage payments, 10 years of breaking his back against this unforgiving land. It all amounted to nothing. Dust. Weaker than the ancient paper that had undone his entire world. He'd figured they'd just run him off. That's how these things went. You took what you could carry and didn't look back. But Tala, she had other ideas. She'd ridden up yesterday with a proposition that knotted his insides with a mix of raw fury and disbelief. Stay. Work this land. Answer to me. A gust of wind stirred the dust, making the fringe on her sleeves dance. She hadn't wasted words in that first meeting, just laid out the terms flat, like she was discussing the price of feed. He'd get the line shack out by the creek. He'd tend the horses, ride the fences, and jump when she said jump. In return, he'd get grub, a roof, and the privilege of staying on the only ground he'd known as a man. The privilege. C had nearly choked on a bitter laugh. He'd almost told her exactly where she could shove her generous offer. But then his gaze drifted past her, to the barn he'd re-roofed, the corral he'd built post by post, the fields he'd cleared of rocks until his palms bled raw. To walk away now wasn't just losing acreage, it was losing the very calluses on his hands, every piece of his soul he'd hammered into this place. So he'd swallowed his pride, swallowed the bile in his throat, and said yes. And he hated himself for it. Now she sat there, waiting, and he knew the next part. The branding, the words that would make it real, the moment his pride either bent or shattered completely. Tala leaned forward, one hand resting steady on the saddle horn. Her voice cut across the silence, sharp and certain, carrying the few yards between them with absolute authority. You work for me now. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a cold statement of fact that tilted the whole world on its axis. C felt something twist hard in his gut. One part of him, the raw, angry part, wanted to spit in her face. Tell her to find some other broken man to humiliate. But another part, the part that had started with nothing and knew how fast nothing could return, knew that survival always trumped pride. He locked his eyes with hers. If it was obedience she wanted, fine. She'd get it. But she wouldn't get the man inside. What do you need done first? His voice was gravel, rougher than he'd intended. A flicker of something crossed her expression. Surprise? Maybe even respect. It was hard to read with the rising sun blazing behind her, framing her in blinding light. She motioned with her chin toward the eastern pasture, where a few horses grazed. Those animals need proper attention. They've been neglected. The words stung like a whip, mostly because they held a kernel of truth. He'd been too consumed with lawyers and court dates to keep everything perfect. But to hear her say it, to hear her criticize his stock on this land, it made his hands clench into white-knuckled fists at his sides. "I'll handle it," he bit out. Tala sized him up for another long, heavy second, and Sai had the chilling certainty that she could read every bitter thought boiling in his mind. Then she did the last thing he expected. She smiled. It held no warmth, no friendship, just a faint, sharp curve of her lips that said she knew exactly what this was costing him, and she was savoring every second of it. "Good," she said. With an expert touch, she spun the horse and rode toward the main house, his house, as if she'd been doing it every day of her life. C stood rooted, watching her go, the dust settling around his worn boots. He'd agreed to stay. He'd agreed to work for her. But the one thing he hadn't agreed to, the one thing her ancient papers couldn't force, was to swallow this defeat. He wouldn't go down easy. The fight would have to be quiet. Careful. The kind of resistance she'd never see coming until it was too damn late. He turned toward the east pasture, his mind already turning the gears. She wanted the horses handled? Fine. He'd handle them better than any hand she'd ever seen. He would make himself necessary, indispensable. And somewhere inside that value, he'd find his leverage. Because Silas Garrett had lost it all once before and clawed his way back up from the dirt. This time he wasn't starting from dirt. He was starting from the inside. And that woman on the horse, with her smug smile and her lawful claim, had just made the single biggest mistake of her life. She'd let him stay. The east pasture held 6 head, and Sai saw the trouble before he was halfway there. The bay mare was favoring her left foreleg. The roan's hooves were overgrown, hadn't seen a rasp in months. The others showed the telltale signs of neglect he'd been too blind, too busy fighting shadows to see. He moved in slow, letting them get his scent. The bay mare lifted her head, ears pricked forward. Something in his chest eased just a fraction. At least the animal still knew him. At least something on this ranch still recognized the man he used to be. The soft fall of hooves on dry grass behind him made his shoulders bunch. He didn't have to look. He knew. "You should start with the mare." Tala's voice carried, crisp on the air. "She's been limping for 2 days. Sai was already running his hand down the mare's leg, feeling for heat, for swelling. I noticed. Did you?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge, a suggestion that she doubted every move he made. His jaw clenched, but he kept his eyes on the horse. The ankle had mild heat. She'd likely taken a bad step on the rocks down by the creek. Nothing that wouldn't mend with proper care. He straightened and finally met Tala's gaze. She'd dismounted, standing 10 feet off, watching him with that same impossible-to-read expression. The sharp morning light glinted off the intricate beadwork on her dress. Her dark hair was pulled back tight in 2 long braids that fell past her shoulders. "She needs rest and cold water wraps," Silas said. 3, maybe 4 days. "Can you handle that without supervision?" The question landed like an open-handed slap. He'd been breaking horses since he was 12 years old. He'd built this entire spread from grit and nothing. And now this woman who hadn't owned the dirt for a week was questioning his fundamental competence. "Yes," he said. The word was sharp, clipped. Tala tilted her head, analyzing him. You're angry. I'm fine. You're angry that I'm here, that I'm giving you orders, that everything you bled for now belongs to someone else. Silas held her stare, refusing to look away. Does it matter what I feel? No, she said, her voice flat. But I prefer to know what I'm working with. Working with? As if he were just another shovel or a length of rope she'd claimed along with the deed. Silas had a dozen razor-sharp replies ready on his tongue, but he bit them back, forcing a slow breath into his tight lungs. Flying off the handle would just prove he was the volatile man she clearly expected. Instead, he turned his back on her, returning to the mare and running his hands down the other horses. He heard Tala move up behind him, the whisper of her moccasins in the dry grass. When he looked up, she was already kneeling, examining the roan's hooves herself. These are a disgrace, she said flatly. I know. Why? The real answer. Because I was busy trying to keep my head above water while your legal ambush drowned me, stuck in his throat. I had other priorities, he said instead. Tala stood straight, dusting off her hands. Not anymore. From this moment, these animals are your only concern. Your first, your last, your every concern. She stepped into his space. Close enough he could smell the wild sage woven into her clothes, and something else, something sharp and clean like pine. Do you understand? Silas met her eyes. This close, he saw things the distance had hidden. A faint, silver scar just above her left eyebrow. The way her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly when she made a point. The iron stillness in her spine that screamed she'd never known a moment of doubt in her life. I understand, he said. Good. She held his gaze a second longer, and a current passed between them. Not peace, not understanding, just something raw and complicated that made the air feel thick. Then she stepped back. I'll send someone with the supplies for the mare. Show them what you need. She started to turn, but Sai's voice, rough and low, stopped her cold. Why? Tala looked back over her shoulder. Why? What? Why keep me here? You could hire any desperate hand in the territory, someone who'd be grateful for the coin, not someone who hates you for breathing. For the first time since she'd ridden onto his land, the mask cracked. Just a flicker. Something behind her eyes that looked almost unsettled. Maybe that's exactly why, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Then she walked to her horse, swung into the saddle in one lithe movement, and rode toward the main house, leaving him standing in a cloud of dust and confusion. Sie tried to make sense of the words. Maybe that's exactly why. Why what? Why keep the man who resented her? Why prefer an enemy under her roof to a grateful stranger? It made no damn sense. But as he turned back to the horses, he couldn't shake the feeling of a trap closing. He was in the dark, and Tala had just lit the first match. The question was whether he could find his way before she burned the whole game to the ground. By noon, Silas had the mare separated and was soaking wraps in a bucket of cold creek water when boot steps crunched in the dirt behind him. Not Tala's light tread. This was heavier. Angrier. He turned to find a man watching him from the fence line. Younger than Tala, maybe 25, with the same dark eyes but a sharper, more hawkish face. He wore traditional leggings, but a practical canvas shirt, and he carried himself like a man who'd never backed down from a fight. You must be the one who lost his spine along with his land, the man said, his voice dripping contempt. Silas rose slowly, keeping his hands clear of his belt, visible and relaxed. Silas Garrett, I know who you are. The man vaulted the fence with a coiled energy. I'm Taza, Tala's brother. Of course he was. C could see the resemblance now. The hard set of the jaw, the direct, challenging stare. But where Tala was controlled fire, Taza was a lit powder keg. She send you to babysit? Silas asked. She doesn't know I'm here. Taza walked closer, his gaze dropping to the mare's leg. He studied it with the practiced eye of a man who knew horseflesh. This one will mend. You know what you're doing? Thanks. Don't thank me. Wasn't a compliment, just a fact. Taza turned his full, burning gaze on Sai. I want to know why you're really here. Your sister made an offer. My sister makes decisions that trouble me. Taza's voice hardened. Keeping you here is one of them. Silas felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. If you've got something to say, spit it out. Your kind stole this land, profited from the blood in the soil, and now that it's back where it belongs, you want to linger, like a vulture, make sure we don't ruin your precious ranch? That's not... Or maybe, Taza cut him off, crowding him, stepping right into his space. You're scheming, waiting for your moment, looking for an angle to steal it all back. The words hit home, stinging because they weren't entirely wrong. Sai did want his land back. But not like this, not through some snake-in-the-grass deception. I'm here because I've got nowhere else to go, Sai said, his voice quiet. Your sister offered me work. I took it, that's all. That's all? Taza barked a laugh that held no humor. You expect me to believe the great Silas Garrett, who fought our claim for months, who hired lawyers and went to Judge Thorne, just rolled over and decided to be a hired hand? Believe whatever you want. Taza studied him, the silence stretching out, taut and dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice was a low threat. Stay away from my sister. The command was a gut punch, coming from nowhere. What? I see how she watches you, like you're a riddle she needs to solve. Taza moved closer still, radiating a challenge. She thinks keeping you here proves some point about justice or mercy. I don't know what. But I know you're kind. You'll use any weakness, any leverage you can find. I haven't. Not yet. Taza's eyes narrowed to slits. But if I catch you trying to twist her, using her interest in you for your own gain, I will personally make you regret the day you stayed. Before Silas could form a response, Taza turned on his heel and strode back to the fence. He paused on the top rail, looking back. One more thing. This claim? It wasn't random. Tala spent 3 years digging, finding the proof, building the case. She didn't just want any land back. She wanted this ranch. He smiled, a cold, sharp expression that held no warmth. You ought to ask yourself why. Then he dropped to the other side and was gone around the barn. Silas stood frozen, the blood draining from his face. This specific ranch, 3 years of research. Why? There were a dozen ranches in the territory sitting on disputed land. Why spend 3 years targeting his? He looked toward the main house, smoke curling from the chimney. Tala was in there, acting like this was all just business, just correcting the ledgers of history. But Taza's words painted a different picture. This wasn't business. This was personal. C knelt beside the mare, his hands moving on their own, securing the cold compress. But his mind was miles away. Tala had spent 3 years aiming a rifle right at his life, had taken everything he had with chilling precision. And now she wanted him here, hating her for it. Maybe that's exactly why. Her cryptic words echoed back, suddenly heavy with a terrifying new meaning. She didn't just want a hired hand, she wanted him. And that realization scared Silas Garrett more than the loss of his entire world. 3 days passed. Silas didn't see Tala again. He mended fences, worked the stock, and tried to push Taza's warning from his mind, but the question festered, a splinter buried too deep to dig out. Why this ranch? The question plagued him. What made this patch of dirt worth 3 years of her life? The answer rode in on the 4th evening, carried by a bruised western sky. Silas was latching the barn against the first fat drops when the clouds tore open. A deluge, the kind of gully washer that turns hardpan to slurry. He was hauling the heavy door shut when he saw her. Tala. Sprinting from the main house, her dress plastered to her frame. She reached the shelter of the barn just as lightning cracked the sky in two. They stood, chests heaving, soaked and breathing the same damp air. "The roof!" she gasped, shoving wet strands of hair from her eyes. "It's leaking. East bedroom. Things are getting ruined." Cy didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from the tack room. "I'll help." They ran, heads down, through the blinding rain, boots sucking at the mud. Inside the house, Silas followed Taylor down the hallway he'd walked 1,000 times. The familiar scent of wood smoke and dust made his throat tighten. The east bedroom was already taking water. A steady drip, drip, drip from the ceiling, pooling on the floorboards. Tala was already shifting crates. Silas unfurled the tarp, covering the worst of it. "More in the closet," she said, pointing. He pulled the closet door open and froze. Tucked behind blankets was a small wooden footlocker. Carved into the lid were the initials, J.G. Josiah Garrett. His initials. His hands went numb. "Where did you get this?" Tala looked up, her gaze following his. When she saw the box, her expression hardened, not with guilt, but with a weary resignation. "It was here when we arrived," she said, her voice low. "Hidden in the attic, wrapped up and forgotten." With trembling hands, Silas lifted the box down. He'd thought everything of his father's was long gone. Sold off to pay the debts after his death, years before Cy had managed to buy the ranch back. By then, the past had been wiped clean. He lifted the lid. Letters, old deeds, and a leather-bound journal he knew instantly. His father's distinct, sloping handwriting filled the page. "You should read them," Tala said. The tone in her voice made him look up. She stood by the window, silhouetted by the storm, her usual iron composure showing a hairline fracture. She looked nervous. "Why?" he asked. "Because then you'll understand why I spent 3 years taking this land back." She moved from the window, her wet clothes molding to her frame. "Your father didn't buy this ranch from some homesteader, Silas. He bought it from my grandfather, Hakan. And Hakan didn't sell it. Not really." The words were body blows. C looked from the journal in his hands to her face. "What are you talking about?" "Read the letters," she insisted. "The real land deal. How your father got this place for pennies because my grandfather was desperate. How he promised our people access to the northern grazing lands, and then fenced them off. My father wasn't he?" Tala's voice was steady, but fire burned in her eyes. "Read his own words, Cy. Read the promises he made, and the ones he broke." Thunder rattled the window panes. Silas stood there, holding his father's sins, the very foundation of his life turning to quicksand. "Why didn't you just tell me this? Would you have believed me?" She stepped closer. They were inches apart, the air charged with rain and revelation. "You needed to lose it, Silas. You needed to feel, just once, what it's like to have everything you built torn away by someone else's paper. So, this was revenge. This was justice." She reached out, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the box. "But I didn't expect you to stay. I didn't expect—" She stopped, her voice catching. Didn't expect what? The rain hammered the roof, a frantic drumming against the tarp. Tala looked at him, and the mask was gone. In its place was something vulnerable, frightened. I didn't expect you to make this so complicated, she whispered. Before he could find his voice, heavy footsteps echoed in the hall. They both spun as Taza filled the doorway. He took in the scene. His sister, soaked, standing far too close to Silas. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Taza's expression turned thunderous. Tala, we need to talk, now. She straightened instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the leader's steel. Without another glance at Silas, she followed her brother from the room. C was left alone, the storm raging outside, and his father's secrets heavy in his hands. For the first time, he wondered if the real loss was just beginning. Silas spent that night in the line shack, the journal open under the flickering lamplight. Every page was a fresh betrayal. The deal with Tala's grandfather, Hakan, was exactly as she'd said. Worse, his father, Josiah, had offered partnership, shared use, fair pay. Then, the ink barely dry, he'd fenced off the northern ranges, threatened the law when the Apache tried to use the paths they'd walked for generations. The entries near the end turned defensive. Excuses, justifications. Josiah Garrett had convinced himself that protecting his investment was just business. That survival meant you couldn't afford sentiment. By the time the gray light of dawn touched the prairie, Silas understood. He knew why Taylor had targeted this land, why she needed him, specifically, to feel the sting of what her people had felt, the powerlessness, the raw injustice of having your world stolen by another man's rules. He was feeding the last damning page into the stove when he heard the hoofbeats, not Tala's steady rhythm. This was aggressive, fast. He stepped outside as Taza reined his horse in hard, dismounting in a spray of dirt. "You need to leave," Taza said. No greeting. "Your sister gave me a job." "I don't care what she gave you." Taza stalked closer. "You're poison here. Every day you stay, you make it harder for her to lead." Silas crossed his arms, forcing himself to stand his ground. "And how am I doing that?" "By making her forget." Taza's voice was a low snarl. "She's starting to see you as something other than the son of the man who stole from us. That's dangerous." "Maybe that's progress." "Progress?" Taza laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "She spent 3 years convincing the elders that this land mattered, that this was justice for every broken promise your people ever made. And now she's letting the enemy sleep in our shacks and work our horses." "I'm not the enemy. You're Josiah Garrett's son." Taza jabbed a finger at his chest. "That makes you the exact enemy. And worse, you're the enemy she's drawn to. That makes her compromised." The accusation hung in the cold morning air. Silas felt his blood run cold. "She told you that?" "She didn't have to. I know my sister." Taza's expression was granite. "Last night, she defended you to the elders, said you deserved a chance, that you weren't your father, that keeping you here served some greater purpose." "What purpose?" "That's what they want to know." Taza moved in, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Some think she's testing you, others think she's lost her mind. And a few think she's fallen for the exact kind of manipulation I warned you about." "I haven't manipulated anyone." "Haven't you?" Taza's eyes raked over him. The poor, grieving son, discovering his father's sins. The humble worker, taking his punishment. It's a hell of a performance. The man who stays loyal, even with empty pockets. It's a fine performance. Raw fury flared in Silas's chest. "You think I'm happy about any of this? Learning my father was a liar? Losing a decade of my life? Working land that was stolen in the first place? I think you're adaptable, Taza said, his voice cold as a snake. And I think you smell an opportunity. My sister has power. She has resources, and she's showing an interest in you. What better way to reclaim what you lost than by sinking your claws into her? Before Silas could move, Tala's voice cut through the tension like a thrown knife. That is enough, Taza. They both turned. She stood 20 feet away, having approached unheard. Her face was a mask of control, but Silas could see the rage simmering just beneath the surface. He needs to hear this, Taza spat. I said, enough. Tala strode forward, physically placing herself between them, facing her brother. Silas works here because I decided he works here. My reasons are my own. Your reasons are affecting the elders' trust in your judgment. Then the elders can question me directly, she retorted, her voice level but gaining a dangerous edge. What they cannot do is send my brother to intimidate someone under my protection. Protection? The word landed on Silas with a strange, unexpected weight. Taza stared at his sister, a long, burning silence stretching between them. You're making a terrible mistake. Perhaps, Tala said quietly, but it is mine to make. Taza shook his head, a look of profound disgust on his face. He stalked to his horse and mounted. Before riding off, he leveled one last look at Silas, a look that was a curse. When this blows up in your faces, and it will, remember I warned you both. He was gone, a cloud of angry dust in his wake, leaving Silas and Tala standing in the stark morning light. She didn't look at him, just watched her brother disappear toward the main settlement. Finally, she turned. You read the journal. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded. And now you understand. I understand my father was worse than I knew, Silas said, his voice hollow. I understand why you wanted this land, why you needed me to lose it. He paused, meeting her gaze. What I don't understand is why you're defending me to your people. Tala studied him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice held something he'd never heard before, a tremor of uncertainty. Neither do I, she admitted. You should be nothing to me, a symbol, the son of the man who broke us. But you're not. She moved closer, and Silas could see the raw conflict in her eyes. You stayed when any other man would have run. You work without complaint. You took responsibility for sins that were never yours. She shook her head slightly. That matters. Does it matter enough to risk your leadership? I don't know yet. She held his gaze, her own unwavering. But I intend to find out. The sun finally broke free of the horizon, bathing them both in a sudden golden light. And in that moment, Silas realized the true danger wasn't losing the ranch anymore. It was losing himself to this woman, this impossible woman who was a tangle of justice, vengeance, and second chances. A woman, he knew, with a sickening lurch, who was just about to find out he felt the exact same way. The meeting of the elders happened 2 days later. Silas wasn't invited. He didn't need to be. He could hear it all from the barn where he was currying the mare. The voices carried on the hot afternoon wind. Tala's, measured and strong. Taza's, sharp and accusatory. And the rumble of others he didn't recognize, all questioning, all doubting. He tried to focus on the rhythm of the brush, but every raised voice made his hand freeze. This was his fault. His very presence was the wedge Taza had predicted, driving itself between Tala and her people. The mare nudged his shoulder, sensing his tension. Silas forced a steadying breath and kept working. Whatever happened in that meeting, it was out of his hands. His choice was the same as it had been from the beginning. Stay and face the verdict, or run and prove Taza right. He heard fast footsteps approaching the barn. Sai looked up. It was Chaitin, one of the younger men from Tala's group, his expression grim. "You have to leave, now." "What happened?" "The elders voted. You have until sunset to be off this land." Chaitin glanced nervously toward the main house. "If you're still here after dark, they'll escort you." Silas's chest tightened. "Where's Tala?" "Still in there, arguing." Chaitin shook his head. "But it's done. The decision was made." The man's voice softened, just a fraction. "She tried, Garrett. Harder than she should have. But they won't risk their leader's judgment over someone like you." Someone like you. The son of Josiah Garrett. The son of a thief. It didn't matter what Silas had done. He wore his father's sins like a second skin. "I understand," Silas said quietly. Chaitin nodded once and left. Silas stood alone in the barn, the smell of hay and horses suddenly suffocating. He'd known this was temporary. He'd known it would end badly. But damn him, he'd let himself hope. He was checking the mare's stall when Tala appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted, angry, and deeply, deeply weary. "You heard," she stated. "Yes." "I'm sorry," she said, the words sounding raw. "I tried to convince them. I told them you weren't your father, that you'd proven it. But they see it differently." C moved closer. "They're not wrong, Tala." "They are wrong." Her voice snapped, gaining strength from her anger. "You've worked harder than any of them. You've accepted a blame that isn't yours. You've shown more integrity than half the men on that council. That doesn't change what I represent to them." "No," she whispered, looking away. "It doesn't." The silence in the barn was heavy, broken only by the soft stamp of a horse. Silas wanted to say something, anything, to ease the burden he'd placed on her. But every word felt hollow. "There is another option," Tala said finally, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it. "One the elders didn't consider, because I didn't offer it." "What option?" She turned back to him, and the raw vulnerability in her eyes made his breath hitch. "You could stay, as something other than a hired hand, something that would give you standing in this community." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. "Tala, I know what you're saying." "That it's too fast," she cut in, stepping closer. "That we barely know each other. That the circumstances are all wrong. I know." She was right in front of him now. "But I also know what I feel when I look at you. And I think you feel it too." He did. God help him, he did. The pull had been there since that first morning, a dangerous undercurrent to the anger and resentment. Every fight, every tense conversation had only layered it, twisting frustration into respect, and anger into a raw, complicated want that was impossible to ignore. "If I stay that way," Silas said, his voice rough, "I become exactly the man Taza accused me of being, someone using you to get back what I lost." "Is that what you'd be doing?" she asked, her gaze searching his. "No," he said, the word torn from him, firm and absolute. "But how would anyone else see it?" Tala reached up and laid her hand against his face. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, it stopped the air in his lungs. "Because I would tell them," she whispered. "Because I would make them see that this wasn't manipulation, that this was something real, something that happened despite every reason it shouldn't have." Before Silas could respond, a shout tore through the compound. "Fire! Fire at the north pasture!" They both spun. Another voice, frantic. "The horses! They're trapped! The flames are spreading fast! Tala's eyes flew wide. The breeding stock! They're all in that pasture! She was moving before Silas had even processed the words, sprinting toward the blaze. He followed, his heart hammering his ribs. The northern pasture backed right up against the dry grasslands, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. A fire there would sweep toward the main compound in hours. Those horses. They were the future. They were everything Tala had worked to reclaim. By the time they reached the inferno, the flames were a roaring wall, devouring the fence line. A dozen horses screamed, trapped inside the ring of fire. Men were already there, trying to smash through the burning rails, but the blistering heat drove them back, shielding their faces. Silas took it all in, his mind racing. The main gate was a lost cause, already collapsing. But the west side? He'd noted rotted posts there just last week, slated for repair. If he could break that section. He was moving before the thought finished. He sprinted toward the weak spot, yanking a heavy, unburned fence post from the ground. Behind him, he heard Tala scream his name, a sound of pure terror. But the screams of the horses were louder. Every second was a lifetime. Silas slammed the heavy post into the rotted wood with every ounce of his strength. The wood groaned. Again. It splintered. The third impact shattered the rails. He kicked the burning splinters aside, ignoring the searing heat that licked at his skin. The opening was narrow, a tight gap, but it would have to do. He plunged through it, into a blinding wall of smoke. The enclosure was chaos. Terrified horses, eyes white with panic, ran in circles. Their cries cut through the roar of the fire. Silas forced the panic down in his own chest. If he panicked, they all died. He grabbed the lead mare, his hands finding her halter. She fought him, rearing back, but he held firm, using his own body as a bulwark, shoving her toward the gap. She fought him until her nostrils caught the scent of clean air. Then she bolted, crashing through the opening. 1 down, 11 to go. The smoke was thicker now, acrid and suffocating. C ripped his shirt up over his mouth and pushed deeper into the inferno. He could hear Tala shouting orders outside, the frantic sounds of men trying to form a water line, but they couldn't get close. He found 3 more, huddled against the far fence, the fire just yards away. He spoke low and steady, the voice he'd used for years. They knew that voice. They trusted it. The lead gelding shifted, letting Silas grab his halter. He led them, one hand on the gelding, the other 2 following by instinct, back toward the gap. They burst through. He heard a ragged cheer from the men outside. But 8 horses were still trapped in the smoke. His lungs were on fire. Every breath was like swallowing embers. He pushed forward, guided only by the sounds of terrified whinnying. 4 more burst from the smoke, running wild. Silas threw himself in their path, waving his arms, turning them, hazing them toward the opening. They stampeded past, so close he felt the scorching heat of their hides. The smoke eddied, clearing for just a second, and his heart sank. The last 4. They were pinned against the eastern fence, a wall of flame cutting off their retreat. They had nowhere to go. He had seconds. The smart move, the sane move, was to get out, to save himself, to cut his losses. But Silas Garrett hadn't built his life by cutting losses. He'd built it by refusing to quit when quitting was the only sensible option. He roared, running at the fire line, using the post he still carried like a club, beating back the burning grass. It wasn't enough to stop the blaze, but it opened a path, a narrow, suicidal gap. "Come on!" he screamed, his voice raw. "Move! Move!" The horses saw it. They bolted. 3 lunged through the gap. But the 4th, a young mare, the one he'd seen Tala working with, She stumbled. Her leg buckled. She went down hard. Silas didn't think. He moved. He grabbed her halter and hauled, his muscles screaming. The mare scrambled to her feet, favoring the injured leg. Behind them, the wall of fire consumed the gap he'd made. The path was gone. There was only one way out. Back across the pasture, through the western gap. And the mare couldn't run. Silas wrapped an arm around her neck, half carrying, half dragging her, pulling her toward the break in the fence. The mare fought him, hysterical with pain and fear, but he held on, forcing her through smoke so thick he was moving blind. His boot hit solid ground. The opening. He shoved the mare through with his last ounce of strength and fell after her, collapsing onto the blessed, clean air of the yard. Hands were on him instantly, dragging him clear. Someone doused his smoldering shirt with water. He heard someone yelling for bandages. Silas tried to push himself up, but his legs were water. Through smoke-stung, streaming eyes, he saw Tala drop to her knees beside him. Her face was a mask of soot and tears. "You stupid, stubborn, reckless," she choked out, then couldn't finish. She just grabbed him, pulling him against her, holding on as if he were smoke himself, about to disappear. Over her shoulder, Silas saw them. The elders. The men who had voted to exile him. They were standing in a silent group, just watching. The hostility was gone. The suspicion was gone. Their faces held something new, something that looked like awe. Taza approached slowly, his face unreadable. He knelt by Silas, meeting his gaze. For a long second, neither man spoke. Then, Taza placed a hand on Sai's shoulder. "You could have died in there," he said, his voice quiet, rough. "The horses, they could have been replaced." Taza's grip tightened, his knuckles white. "You saved them all, every last one, including the mare my sister raised from a foal." Silas looked past him, to Tala. She was just watching him, her expression stripped of everything. The leader, the adversary, the complicated woman. She was just seeing him for the first time. "You didn't save them for me," she whispered, her voice thick. "You didn't do it to prove a point. You did it because it was right." Silas coughed, his lungs seizing. "They were your horses, your future. I couldn't." "Our horses," Tala interrupted, her voice suddenly strong. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the elders, then landing on her brother. When she spoke again, her voice rang with authority across the silent compound. "Our future, our land, our community." The weight of that hour settled over everyone. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. A fact that they could either accept or challenge. No one challenged it. Taza stood, turning to face the elders. "I was wrong about him," he said, his voice clear. "We all were. This man is not Josiah Garrett's son. He is his own man, and he just proved he belongs on this land more than most of us." One by one, the old men nodded. It wasn't enthusiastic. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement. Silas felt Tala's hand find his. Their fingers laced together, and she squeezed. "You work for me now," she whispered, a small, trembling smile playing on her lips, even as tears tracked through the soot. "Except, not really." "Not anymore," Silas managed, a weak laugh that turned into a hacking cough. "Then what am I?" Tala leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, her words for him alone. "You're the man I choose," she said simply. "If you'll have me." 2 weeks later, Silas stood in that same northern pasture, watching the sun rise over land he'd once called his. His hands were still wrapped in clean linen, but the burns were healing. Everything, it seemed, was healing. He heard the familiar hoofbeats and turned. Tala approached on the same bay mare from that first morning, but when she looked down at him now, the distance was gone from her eyes. The calculation was gone. There was only warmth and something deeper, something that made his chest ache in a good way. "The elders met again this morning," she said, swinging down from the saddle. Silas felt his stomach tighten. "They want to formalize your position here." She walked closer, close enough for him to see the small, genuine smile on her face. "Not as a hired hand," she said, her voice soft. "As a partner, in managing this land." The word hit Silas with an unexpected weight. Partner, not owner. He knew that part of his life was gone for good. But partner, that was something different, something more. What did you say?" "I told them yes," Tala said, reaching out to take his bandaged hand, her touch careful. "On one condition, that we run this place together. Not me giving orders while you choke on your pride. A real partnership. Equal say. Equal responsibility." Silas looked out at the land. The barns his father, Josiah, had built on a foundation of broken promises. The corral he had sweat over, believing every post he set was rightfully his. The high plains that had belonged to Tala's people long before a Garrett had ever set foot in the territory. "I don't deserve that," he said quietly. "This ain't about deserving." Tala's grip tightened. "You proved yourself, not by working hard or taking my orders, but by caring about something bigger than your own claim. You cared about the horses, about our future." She stepped closer, her eyes holding his. "When you ran into that inferno, you weren't thinking about property lines or old grudges. You were thinking about saving what mattered, to all of us." Silas studied her face, the strong, proud line of her jaw, the dark eyes that had seen him at his absolute lowest and still found something worth saving, the unshakable confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was. "Your brother," he asked, his voice rough. "Taza, was he the one who—" Tala smiled then, a full, bright smile that transformed her face. "He's the one who proposed it to the elders. He said, 'Any man willing to walk through fire for horses that aren't his has earned the right to help decide their future.'" Something tight and cold in Silas's chest finally broke loose. Taza's approval. It meant more than he could have reckoned. It wasn't forgiveness for Josiah's sins. That kind of wound would take generations to scar over. But it was acceptance, acknowledgement that he was not his father. "So," he asked, "what happens now?" Tala pulled him closer, mindful of his burns. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying on the pasture wind. "Now," she said, "you work with me, not for me, with me, to build something that neither of us could ever build alone." Silas thought of the journal pages he'd burned, all his father's hollow justifications. Josiah had seen this land as a thing to be owned, to be controlled, to wring profit from. But standing here with Tala, Silas finally understood the real truth. You don't own land like this. You belong to it. The duty wasn't ownership. It was stewardship, a partnership, not a dominion. "I can do that," he said. Tala rose up on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't a desperate, hurried kiss, but one that was slow and certain, a promise made in the bright light of day, with the grazing horses as their witnesses and the endless sky overhead. When she pulled back, she kept her hand in his. "One more thing," she said. "The main house. I'm moving my things into the east wing. The west wing, it's yours, if you want it." Silas understood exactly what she was offering. not his father's house, returned. This was a shared roof, a shared life, a future built on something stronger than old documents and legal claims. "I want it," he said. They stood together, watching the prairie wake up. The horses moved through the grass in patterns older than any deed or title. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth. And in the distance, Silas could see Taza already directing a crew, rebuilding the burned fence. Silas Garrett had lost everything he thought mattered. The property, the legacy, the illusion that his sheer will had built something permanent. But in losing it all, he had found something his father had never possessed: community, purpose, and a woman who had taken everything from him, only to give back something infinitely more valuable. A partnership built on truth, not on broken promises. A future constructed from ashes, not on stolen ground. And a love that grew, not despite their history, but because of it. Tala squeezed his hand once more, then released it and swung up onto her horse. "Come on, partner," she said, the word settling between them, solid and true. "We've got work to do." Silas smiled and followed her toward the corral. Not toward the future he'd planned. Not the one he'd fought for, but the one he'd earned. By learning that some things matter more than ownership. Things like justice, like redemption, and like building something, together, that neither could build alone. The horses needed tending. The fences needed mending. The land needed them. And for the first time since losing everything, Silas knew he was exactly where he belonged.